Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the stories and please subscribe. Kevin and I were both in our mid-teens and, let's just say, more than a little adventurous. Nothing serious, just the sort of mischief two teenage boys on summer break who had way too much free time would get into. This day, I remember vividly. It started out normal enough. Kevin's older sister Liz was with us. She was a couple years older than us, about 16 as I recall. The three of us lived in a neighborhood in rural Florida. It was the part of Florida that is nothing like the postcards you see of tanned girls, pink flamingos, and gleaming skyscrapers. No, we lived in what was called Everglades adjacent. But really, it was a neighborhood that existed because some developers drained the swamp enough to build some homes on it. It was a stifling Friday, and the three of us had been playing manhunt. Liz told us she wanted a smoke, and Kevin decided to join her. I opted out. Kevin, Liz, and I were hanging in the outskirts of this clearing as they smoked, trying to decide what to do next. I don't remember whose idea it was, but anyway, we decided it would be fun to go for a little hike in the woods. Kevin swore that there was a river that you could go swimming in. This sounded like a great idea on a hot summer day in Florida. No one needed to be convinced. We had been walking for about 15 minutes when I realized that we hadn't even considered finding our way back. Most of rural Florida looks the same. Oak trees with Spanish moss, palmettos, and pine needles. None of us had thought about leaving a trail. I took out my phone to call my mother, but there was no signal. I suggested that we go back since we hadn't told anyone about where we were, and it was getting to that mid-afternoon thunderstorm time. They agreed that we should turn around, and we thought that we had. It turns out Liz had no sense of direction, and she led us deeper into the woods. We walked for about 30 minutes when we realized how lost we were. Nothing looked familiar, but at the same time, everything did. The same flora and fauna we had seen when we entered surrounded us. I decided I needed to form a plan, having given up on Kevin and Liz finding a way out. If we could find another open space, we could signal for help or even get a phone signal. We walked for 30 more minutes, and although I didn't know exactly where we were, it did feel like we crossed over into the national park. I felt like we were on the right track. We trudged on. We were all dehydrated, hungry, and bleeding from going straight through a field of palmettos. It was Liz who first spotted the hunting tree stand. This was odd. Hunting was strictly forbidden in the park. Maybe we got turned around, maybe not. I couldn't be sure. It was Kevin who first saw the cages, at least 20 of them. Huge metal cages with hatches propped open by sticks. Liz thought it was for catching wild boars, although none of us had ever seen or heard of them around town. Some of the cages had dried blood around them, and one looked as though it had been kicked hard from the inside. While strange, we had no choice but to keep moving. The entire time, Kevin had been trying to call his dad. Still no signal. I was exhausted, bleeding, and covered in bug bites. We weren't dressed or prepared for this. What started out as a 15-minute hike to the river to swim was turning into a day-long battle for survival. I'm probably being melodramatic, but that's how it felt at the time. We needed to take a break, and I sat on a log with Liz while Kevin walked around, holding his phone up in the air, trying to get a signal. He left our sight for maybe 10 minutes when I heard him scream. Liz and I sprinted towards where we thought the sound came from, but I froze when I saw two men. One was about 60 with white blonde hair that hung down to his shoulders and a weather-beaten face. He was covered in dirt, and the denim shirt he was wearing was shredded to bits. The other was about 25, and he looked like he had just left his job at a cubicle in a button-down white shirt and nice pants. Oddly, they weren't wearing shoes, and they were both crouching. These two men were just squatting and looking directly at us, their arms limp and dangling close, smiling. They stayed like that for what felt like hours. My body's fight or flight kicked in, and I guess mine chose fight. I crouched down too, and I stared them down. After what I guess was maybe 2 or 3 minutes, the older man stood up and ran into the woods, and the younger one quickly followed. Kevin reemerged from the trees not long after, nearly hysterical. He was crying hard. He asked me repeatedly why we hadn't come when he screamed, and I tried to explain that we couldn't because of those two men. When he finally understood what I was saying, he stopped crying and went silent. We walked for another 20 minutes in dead silence when I saw pavement. We had finally run into civilization, a bike trail that runs through the national park to be exact. I had never been so excited to see asphalt. We found a signal and called our parents, and we sat on the ground and cried together in relief. It had only been 4 hours, but it had felt like days. My mother brought us water and yelled at me for running off into the woods and getting lost. But she was also just relieved that I was okay. I told her about the two men, and she thought it warranted telling the park rangers. I gave them my statement, and that was the end of it. I never heard from them again. About 2 weeks later, Kevin was over at my house playing video games when he brought up the subject of the woods. He told me that he hadn't seen the two men. When he was searching for a signal, he heard pine needles being crunched underfoot, and it sounded as if something was charging at him, so he hid. He didn't even look behind him. He just hid behind a fallen tree. The noise stopped, and he stood up to return to us when he saw a woman crouching about 15 feet away. She had dry blood in her hair and all over her shirt. That's when Kevin screamed, and she stared at him until she turned around and ran into the woods. To this day, I don't think anyone's ever found them. As for me, I never ever went back into those woods.
Hiking has been my passion for as long as I can remember, so when the chance to walk the Appalachian Trail came up, I jumped at it. I'd never done a hike this long and this far by myself, but I was determined to conquer it. For those who don't know, the Appalachian Trail is about 2,000 miles, covering 14 states from Georgia to Maine. It's a nice blend of exhilarating challenges and peaceful solitude, all wrapped in dense forests, tranquil valleys, and towering peaks. Along the trail, entire communities thrived, providing food, shelter, and supplies for these intrepid hikers. Trying to get myself acclimated, I spent the first 3 nights with various groups of hikers I met along the way. We'd swap tales, share food and drinks, and generally have a good time with people of similar interest. It was on the 4th night that I decided to camp alone. It was a chance to prove to myself I could cut it out here on my own. As the sun set, I was starting to get a little nervous. At first, I chalked it up to missing the camaraderie I had developed with the other hikers I'd met along the way. But despite my growing nervousness, I spent the next 3 nights by myself. Unfortunately, my unease only grew worse. It was as if I felt eyes on me the whole time. An absurd notion, I must admit. I tried to convince myself it was just my rational mind waging battle with my paranoia. Yet, the sense of being watched was unshakable. This was made worse when I woke one morning to find my backpack partially open. Had I left it unzipped? That didn't seem like something I would do. Even more troubling, some of my gear looked like it had been moved from the night before, like not in entirely different locations. It was more like my stuff had been picked up and put back down, but not in the exact same spot. The feeling was strong enough that for the next couple of nights I set up camp near other people. But I was feeling a little silly about it, and I was determined to conquer my fears. So I decided to set up camp by myself again the following night. Unfortunately, the feeling I was being watched returned. It was so strong and unnerving that night, I decided to call off the remainder of the hike when I reached the next town. I made up an excuse to tell my friends and family. Feeling embarrassed that I couldn't cut it, I told them I sprained my ankle and would have to try again next year. It was a couple of weeks later that I was going through the pictures of the hike I had taken on my digital camera. The images rekindled a bittersweet mix of nostalgia and regret. But nestled among the photos of the mountain ranges and fleeting friendships was something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a picture of me asleep in my tent, completely unaware. At first, I smiled, thinking it was a prank by one of my fellow hikers, but I couldn't tell which night it was, though, as there wasn't anything distinguishing about the image. I flipped to the next photo and the next, each one of me asleep in my tent. Yet, as I continued, realization dawned on me that the images were from those nights I had camped alone. This wasn't a prank by one of my fellow hikers. Somebody else had done this. Someone who was watching me. Someone who had followed me from campsite to campsite. My camera had captured what my eyes had not, the realization sinking in. I had never been alone. I'd been an avid mountain biker for as long as I can remember. I got my first serious mountain bike when I was around 13 or 14 years old, and have been riding the trails ever since. I've never been that hardcore about it. I don't time myself or keep track of my miles or anything. I just enjoyed listening to my music and riding around the trails near my home. I woke up to a beautiful springtime Saturday. It was a perfect day for a great ride to this particular spot way up the mountains, where you could get an unencumbered view of the Pacific Ocean. I'd ridden up there several times before, but it's a long ride, so it wasn't my usual path. But I was feeling adventurous, and I knew the way well enough. After unloading my bike from the car, I checked my gear and got my pack ready. About a dozen yards away, I noticed this couple doing the same thing. Both looked like they were in their mid-20s, so about my age. I don't remember who began the conversation, but I started chatting with the girl, and we hit it off pretty well. She said she rode around here a lot too, and although I don't think I'd seen her before, she seemed like someone I could be friends with. She introduced me to her boyfriend, also an avid mountain biker. He was friendly, and they talked about some trails they rode in the area. They both seemed pretty cool. They asked me if I wanted to ride with them to their favorite trail. I thought it might be fun. I'd make some new friends and learn the area better for future bike rides. I followed them out of the parking lot and climbed the hill where the path forked. We stopped momentarily to catch our breath, and she pointed to the left, down a trail I'd never been on before. I quickly realized that both of them were a lot faster than I was, like a lot faster, but I liked to push myself a bit, so I took it as a challenge. I kept up with them, and although I struggled a lot more, I probably wasn't more than 10 yards behind them the whole time. After about 45 minutes, we stopped briefly for a water break. I noticed that the girl had strategically left her backpack open, like she closed it but then opened it back up a little bit. I didn't think much about it then, but it was a little odd. I excused myself momentarily, then ducked behind some trees for a bathroom break. Without any sort of warning, the two of them started laughing and then took off. I wasn't entirely done, so I had to scramble a bit to finish up if I wanted to catch them, and when I returned to my bike, they were both completely out of sight. I thought taking off without me was a little uncool, but what really got me pissed was both my tires had been slashed. I was stranded. I sat down on a rock for a few minutes trying to decide what to do. At this point, the sun was directly overhead, and it was getting hot. So I grabbed my bike and started walking down the trail. After about 15 minutes, I saw a wire on the trail. It was tied between two smaller trees about 5 feet off the ground. If I had been riding, it could have easily decapitated me. I stared at it, puzzled as to why she and her boyfriend had done this. They went through the trouble of slashing my tires, so it didn't entirely make sense. Maybe they were trying to snare another rider? Or perhaps they weren't the ones who did this at all. It was just weird and disturbing. While my mind went through many crazy scenarios, I used my knife to cut the wire. I didn't know what was happening here, and I certainly didn't want any more surprises, so I decided to push my bike in the opposite direction from where I thought they went. It was a long 6 miles, but eventually I made it back to my car. The car the couple had arrived in was gone. There was a ranger station near the parking lot, so I stopped there on my way out. I asked them about the two bikers. I gave them a description of the couple, but wasn't able to provide them with enough information to have them identified. They wrote up a report and I went home. I never heard anything more about that couple. I also never went back to those trails again.
Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.